Hello and welcome to another episode of the Express Economist. This week, we have with us Mr. Louis Kuijs, Chief Economist with Asia Pacific at S&P Global Ratings. As many of you might know, this is a big firm analyzing governments and economies across the world. And the topic today is a little different from regular news events. This week, we'll be talking to him about what India can do about improving manufacturing in India. Now, one of the key elements for the past 3 decades since liberalization, and in fact, even before that, had been that India must improve its manufacturing sector. And the reason for that is that manufacturing sector is capable of soaking up the excess labor that is there in the agriculture sector. India was predominantly agrarian. But what has happened is that both in terms of the contribution to GDP and the employment that it involves, India's manufacturing has largely remained stagnated. And what we have seen in the past 3 decades is that people have actually moved from agriculture direct to services sector, and that has started contributing quite handsomely. But one basic argument remains that India cannot really grow to be a rich country, especially in per capita incomes, until unless we become a manufacturing powerhouse. Now, today's episode is to understand why it hasn't happened and what can be done to achieve that kind of target. We've seen that even the current government that came in 2014 and made a very bold promise that we will have a Make in India program has actually witnessed manufacturing jobs being halved from around 51 million to 27 million between 2016 and 2020. The pandemic perhaps would have made things even worse. So let's get started with talking to Louis about how we can achieve that target of becoming a richer country through the manufacturing process. Louis, thanks a lot for joining us today on the show.
Pleasure, Uli. Thanks for having me.
First of all, I would like to understand, why is it, considered so essential that a country must have manufacturing growth to become a richer country in terms of per capita incomes?
Yes, I think there are a few aspects to this. One is there are a few characteristics that the manufacturing sector has that you don't really find in the service sector. It tends to create a lot of jobs, and it creates those jobs not only for people with college degrees, but it can create those jobs for people who can basically read and write. Like you can become a skilled machine operator and you can actually get better at that job and therefore, benefit from the technological progress that is taking place in that sector, with 9 or 10 years education. And that is a very powerful driver that some countries have successfully used to create a lot of urban employment. Not always the most fancy kind of employment, but very meaningful, employment that could lead to the middle class. I think another important aspect is talking again about that productivity growth. We know that the manufacturing sector has a relatively high level of productivity growth. It also tends to see that productivity continues to grow over time at a pretty good pace. If you look at, if you want to understand why do the manufacturers in German's manufacturing, why do the people that work in German's manufacturing industry, why do they have these very nice wages and wonderful, pay packages? It is because they have benefited from the technological progress that these companies are going through. And so that is a second very powerful driver of economic growth. And then I would say thirdly, there is something that tends to sometimes hold back emerging markets, and India has had these issues too. If you are not able to make the bulk of the items that your rapidly growing middle class wants to buy, if you're not able to make the bulk of them yourself, then whenever you have strong growth in your country, you tend to run a large external deficit. You start to import much more than you export, and that tends to that can become a macroeconomic or financial problem. It can create problems for your currency and things like that. And so that is why there is also a financial stability or macroeconomic element to this. And what we have seen over time is that if you go back to the European countries, or if you go back to the East Asian countries, meaning countries that have seen a successful transition into high income status, it's not really easy to find countries, other than the very small ones, say like Singapore, that have not used manufacturing as a powerful motor of their development into higher income status.
Thanks. You very beautifully explained why manufacturing matters so much, especially for a country like India with the kind of size and the population that we have, and why it matters to grow through manufacturing, how incomes may increase there. And there's a lot of debate about why India never really got onto that bus of manufacturing growth. One typical set of arguments is that India never had the labor and land reforms. The other is that a lot of people say that, India managed around those problems and the problem lies somewhere else. What is your understanding about where India might have missed the bus? Why hasn't our economy graduated to that level?
Yeah, I'm not the world's most well-read expert on India, but I have looked a little bit at it also, at times comparing the situation to China. And I think there is some merit in these points about the labor laws that seem to make it harder for manufacturing companies to grow their business and their employee base. Things become a bit harder once you reach more than 100 people. There are definitely also problems in terms of the land law situation. We have seen, for instance, in India, foreign companies sometimes giving up. It was too hard to actually, to get the land, having to negotiate with hundreds or sometimes thousands of individual people. And so we have seen foreign companies giving up on that front. And I would imagine that it is even, complicating life for Indian companies as they want to set up a new base. So, the reforms in those areas are an issue. I think also going back in history, looking at how infrastructure has at times been a bottleneck, in terms of electricity, the coal situation. It's very important if you are positioning yourself as a possible candidate, for a big Japanese or German or American firm. It's important that you can convince those people that they can produce in your locality, and that they won't have power cuts or bureaucrats making life difficult. So the stability of your investment climate, and more generally, the stability of the business climate, and these things like these basics like infrastructure, land, labor laws are very important in attracting investment, both foreign but also Indian manufacturing investment.
Right. There's just a minor query that always comes up is that, last year, I think not last year, 2020, in the wake of the pandemic, many state governments in India removed all labor laws, even the Minimum Wages Act or some acts pertaining to health and safety, with the argument that we'll remove all laws and remove all notions of such health and security to boost employment. Now, there's always this query that should we exploit our own people, as some argue is happening in, say, Bangladesh, which beats us in many ways, at least on garment industry. or in Vietnam? Should we exploit our people? So is there a golden mean there to arrive at good labor laws without exploiting?
I mean, I think that's a great question because indeed, governments can go too far, and business lobbies can go too far in demanding things. I personally think that, again, if you look back at the history of, say, Germany, South Korea, Japan, I don't think that these governments sacrificed the rights and the dignity of their workers in their quest for manufacturing prowess. On the contrary, almost, if you look at Germany and Japan, these countries actually have relatively good relationships between business and labor, also even organized labor in the case of Germany. I personally think that the German experience is important because if you have a more consensual and less conflictory engagement between business and labor, that can also help the business sector. If you're, I think the more longer term commitment and the longer term relationships that you can develop by a more consensual approach and by an approach that sees the workers as partners rather than as people to be exploited. I think in addition to the issue of fairness, it can also actually help you in boosting your productivity growth. And again, it's about the stability. I think a very conflictory mode between capital and labor tends not to be very conducive to long-term development.
One more query on the issue about issue of growing on the manufacturing side is that a lot of people point out that the Asian growth story of, say, a South Korea or of a China was of a time when globalization was increasing. More and more countries wanted to be part of the global trade order, and that has retreated. Definitely, there's been a deglobalization. More and more countries are becoming protectionist. There's so one question, one query is, can India still do it at a time when globalization is being hurt? The other associated query is that a lot of people, most famously Raghuram Rajan, who's the former RBI governor, who said that when this government came out with Make in India, he said, I think instead of make in India, make for India, that you don't actually have to depend on the global audience or the global demand, just there is domestic demand you can make for them. Now, could you just reflect a bit on that? Is it still possible under the circumstances?
Yeah, this is a very reasonable concern or question because indeed, the globalization process, whether it has already gone into reverse or not is still a question for the the academics to work out. But definitely, it's a less obvious climate nowadays for international exchanges than, say, 20 years ago. But I would make a few points on that. One is, I don't think you have anything to lose in trying. On the contrary, even if it is harder, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. I also think that we shouldn't really get too gloomy on this question, because if you look, for instance, in Asia, at the likely growth of demand in China, demand in Southeast Asia, and to the point of Dr. Rajan, in India itself, it doesn't really matter so much whether you are producing, for your own growing market or for your neighbor's growing market. It is about, is demand still going to grow, and are you able to provide that demand? I think I've had discussions with people in Africa and, for instance, in small Central American countries. There it becomes hard. I think it becomes hard to persuade multinationals to set up a company in a small Latin American country or somewhere in the middle of Africa. But I would argue that India should be able to convince multinationals that if we do our homework in terms of what we talked about before, the basics and the infrastructure, I don't think that India should be too intimidated about the international competition. And then again, to the point of Dr. Rajan, it is very important to keep in mind that this massive domestic market will also continue to grow. And the more that you can, as Indian companies and as Indian workers, the more that you can produce manufacturing products, either to export or to be used in the Indian market, I think the more the better. And it is I think it would be a really not necessary, and it would be very much a pity if Indian people give up on trying to compete with others in terms of producing manufacturing goods.
Right, right. Okay, last question, which is perhaps the $1 million question or $1 billion question, even a $1 trillion question is how does India do it? You've reflected a bit on the labor laws, but you also have worked in the World Bank. You've tracked how China's economy has grown, and China's economy is interesting for us because of the population pressures that they must have faced in the last 2-3 decades, and they've done really well to sort of grow at that pace. So, what can India do, and what are the 1 or 2 or 3 lessons that India can learn from its neighbors, in particular from China, in this regard?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think if you look at the lessons, not just from China, but also from the economies that went through that process before, I think there are a few important lessons. Be humble in the beginning, as in, we cannot all produce airplanes from the start, and it is not necessary. So there is nothing wrong with starting by producing relatively simple goods to massive markets, like textile products, simple electronics, toys. There's nothing embarrassing about producing these in large quantities and making profits with that and creating jobs with that. There is this very powerful, theory or story by a Japanese professor who noticed that about how all the Asian economies are going through phases. They start, with very simple manufacturing products for global markets, and then at some point they move on, like they learn and they can move on to a more sophisticated, more difficult product. I think it is, a great way to actually move up that ladder and not try to start at the top of that ladder, because if you try to start at the top of the ladder, you may not necessarily be best placed to do that. Also, you don't tend to create all those jobs that you are really eager to create. So that is something to keep in mind. Also we talked about the stability and the business friendliness. And when we talk about business friendliness, we don't necessarily mean, that the government should go to the lowest common denominator in terms of tax systems and worker protection. But the climate should be relatively friendly for businesses and predictable. Like, if you set up a manufacturing outlet somewhere, you're not thinking about a few years. You're thinking about, how can I successfully produce here in the coming 10 or 15 or 20 years? So that predictability is really important. And then, again, on these issues like infrastructure, land, there are, if, again, looking at, say, the example of China, I know that, the political and economic model of India is very different from China, and we cannot always just replicate things that went on in another country. But trying to make the land acquisition process simpler for investors should be something that the Indian government has on its priority list. Infrastructure should definitely be there on the priority list. These are, some of the non-contentious issues. I think a more contentious, as in it is debated among experts, issue is, to what extent should the government, try to help and make decisions in this process? We call that industrial policy. To what extent should the government maybe, subsidize certain things or help certain companies? I mean, that is an issue that, people never agree on, and some feel more strongly than others. A lot of Asian governments have done it, but if you look, for instance, at the Chinese experience, the Chinese experts would say we've done it, but we didn't go, in some kind of all-out way and handed out money to everybody who wanted to produce microwaves or so. We've done it in a smart way. So, I mean, industrial policy can work, but it needs to be intelligent, and it needs to not be, a policy where bureaucrats decide everything. So, it is worthwhile to look at how can the government help, but the government should also not, be too. I would say, this is definitely not easy, and many countries have tried without making huge progress. But I would say India, with the capabilities in the private sector and also in its public sector, should be able to, to continue to make progress on this.
Just one minor point, because this is so tempting to ask you. There's massive debate about what should be the role of the government. Should it directly intervene? India had that planning model. China had the state-owned enterprises, and the argument has been that India or China or any such poorer country didn't have the risk capital, didn't have the private sector, a bulky private sector which could take those calls, and the government had to come in. And that even today, in India's case, only when the government takes over that kind of a role will that happen. The other side is saying that that's absolutely the wrong thing, and that can never work, and hence the privatization and everything. How do you sort of see that in the historical context with what China has also achieved?
I think the case of China is quite interesting because absolutely, state-owned enterprises are very important in China's economy overall. If you look at energy, telecom, many such sectors. But if you look at the export-oriented manufacturing sectors, and even more generally the manufacturing sector, it is dominated by the private sector. And especially in the beginning, foreign companies were super important. They still are, but so at the moment it is both foreign and domestic ones. But I would say there are definitely things that the government can do. And in China's case, for instance, we saw that when COVID broke out, we saw that the many local governments in China were super focused on how can we defend our role in the global supply chain, and do we need to help bus workers to the factories? We'll do it. Do we need to cut the fees to get the goods to the ports? We will do that. So there is in China, there is a very hands-on approach by local governments to help the companies in their localities. But at the end of the day, the companies tend to be private sector companies, the ones that export, and they can be private sector or foreign. So it is, I guess maybe a lesson would be the government and the private sector need to find a way to work together. The government should complement and help. Basically, it is a question of, in China, they call that the mobilization of resources. How can we make sure that the workers get to work, that the products can be effectively and cheaply moved to the ports, and do the ports work, and don't make sure that there are no big traffic jams in front of the port. So it is, I think, more about those things than necessarily the government deciding what needs to be produced.
Thanks. So I hope listeners would have understood what is the significance of the manufacturing sector. And India has been facing a massive unemployment crisis. The per capita incomes and expenditures have fallen. We've written many pieces about GDP data showing that, and that remains a massive constraint on growth. Perhaps manufacturing is the key piece that we are missing, and we need to really focus. Policymakers need to focus on that. To a great extent, the government has been pushing on the infrastructure front, but policy predictability, as Louis said, is also a very crucial bit in this puzzle. Thanks a lot, Louis, for sparing so generously of your time and insights. Thanks for being part of the show. And I hope listeners have enjoyed and learned something from this episode. We'll be back next week with another relevant topic. Keep watching. Thank you.